In the early 1900s America, the country was ravaged by tuberculosis, a deadly and incurable disease. The bacterial infection causes painful growths in the lungs that make it incredibly difficult to breathe, resulting in a slow and difficult death called the White Plague. The highly contagious disease can overcome entire families, and in some cases, entire towns. Anything needed to be done to contain it, and fast. Fast forward to the 1910, when the Waverly Hills Sanatorium was established on a high hill in Jefferson County, Kentucky, a hospital for treatment of tuberculosis patients. Doctors and nurses did their best to keep it as self-sufficient, the risk of infection spreading to the surrounding community. They maintained their own essential services, and hospital workers weren't allowed to transfer for the fear of spreading the disease. As soon as Waverly Hills opens, it was overrun with sick patients. The hospital was rebuilt and expanded to meet demand, including the addition of a children's diagnosis of tuberculosis often meant death. This was long before the days of antibiotics. Doctors were at a loss on how to treat the disease. Fresh air, rest, and proper nutrition were thought to be the best treatments, especially fresh air. It was so important that patients were often placed on open patios in front of open windows, regardless of the weather. As the illness progressed, more desperate measures were required, exposing a patient's lungs to ultraviolet light in so-called sunroom was one of the common treatment. An alternative method involved placing balloons into a patient's lungs and inflating them to encourage the lungs to breathe. Then there was a last resort, as the doctors called it, surgically removing some of the ribs and the surrounding muscle tissue to ease the pressure of the lungs. Patients rarely survived it. For cases such as these, nurses had the death tunnel, a 500-foot chute used to lower dead bodies out of the hospital to the bottom of the hill. It wasn't just used for convenience, it helped protect the other patients' mental health. The sight of so many bodies leaving through the front door would have been devastating for the patient's morale. It was business as usual at Waverly Hills until it closed in 1961. New antibiotic treatments managed to do what UV exposure and removing body parts could not, and tuberculosis was almost completely eradicated. Unfortunately for the patients of Waverly Hills, many of them entered the hospital by the front door and left via the death tunnel. Keeping up with the disease left most records in disorder, so no one knows exactly how many people died within Waverly Hills. After Tuberculosis Hospital was closed, Waverly Hills was reopened as a Woodhaven center. No one paid too much attention to what went on, but maybe they should have. In 1982, Woodhaven was closed by the state because of patient neglect. For 20 years, Waverly Hills lay vacant. Despite its disuse, crumbling walls, and increasingly decrepit state, the homeless flocked to the Waverly Hills for a dry place to sleep. It also became a favorite haunt of vandals and parties looking for a thrill. That's when the stories started. The paranormal sightings at Waverly Hills began as the whispers in Jefferson County community. Mysterious doors slamming, lights on when there was no power to the building, the sounds of footsteps in empty rooms, disembodied voices. No one paid the ramblings of the hoodlums and the homeless much mind, but the stories became so frequent they could no longer be ignored. They even piqued the interest of the Louisville Ghost Hunters Society, who came to investigate the hospital and bring its secrets into the light. Since then, the sanatorium has been dubbed one of the most haunted places in the world. Maybe that's because you don't even have to venture inside the building to spot something eerie. Countless people have been seeing the same desperate, spectral woman running out of the front entrance of Waverly Hills. Witnesses saw her hands and legs bound in chains, blood dripping from her wrists and ankles. She screams desperately for someone to help her, then disappears into thin air. Could she have been one of the many victims of tuberculosis who died at the hospital? Or one of the tortured residents of the prison-like elderly home that followed? No one can say. One thing's for sure, the wailing woman isn't alone. The spectral appearances of countless children, like young victims of tuberculosis, still roam the hospital. Many visitors have heard the sounds of children laughing and playing on the building's roof, even singing nursery rhymes like Ring Around the Rosie. When visitors investigate the strange sounds, no one was to be found. It makes sense that the spirits of the children might linger on the roof. They were often taken up there for helotherapy, where doctors exposed them to the sun and fresh air in hopes of alleviating tuberculosis symptoms. More sinister children can be found deeper in the building. On the 3rd floor, the ghost of a little girl has been seen so many times that visitors have given her a name, Mary. Mary appears in different ways to different people, maybe depending on her mood. Sometimes visitors find her harmlessly, though eerie, playing in the hall with a ball. Sometimes she's just lurking and watching. The account of one terrified visitor shows a different side of Mary. The person found a more disturbing Mary in one of the rooms on the 3rd floor and claimed after that Mary wasn't normal. The little girl appeared to have no eyes, just black gaping sockets where the eyes. Witnesses report that the visitor ran screaming from the building and refused to return. Many believe her story, since other witnesses have reported seeing the same girl peering down at them from windows on the 3rd floor. Mary's not the only little one roaming the Waverly Hills upper levels. Just one floor up lurks the ghost of Timmy. He's been seen and discussed so much over the years that it's hard to parcel out the fact from fiction. But legend has that he was 7 years old when he died at Waverly Hills from tuberculosis, and he's been seen ever since. Like Mary, Timmy also has been seen playing with a ball in the hallways, but has become more famous for it, since it's the only thing he ever seems to want to do. Visitors often bring balls with them to the 4th floor in an attempt to communicate with him. Sometimes the balls seem to move on their own. Other times you can hear a ball bouncing and the sound of the boys' laughter. Several photos taken on the 4th floor have appeared on the internet showing the eerie face of a young boy peering around the corner, dying at such a young age. Timmy will forever be a child, one who just wants to play, even if he can't manage to depart from the hospital where a few ghostly children might seem harmless enough, but the 5th floor never fails to horrify. The floor looks normal enough, with a couple of nurses' stations and patients' rooms. Legend has it that the 5th floor is where the doctors housed the tuberculosis patients who had gone mad from their suffering. Though no one can say for sure, reports of strange shapes, disembodied voices, and an unexplained sound are more common on this floor than any other. Hands down, the most mysterious and ghostly part of the floor, possibly even in the building, is room 502. Even just approaching it, visitors often feel incredibly uncomfortable, overwhelmed with a sense of despair. That would make sense considering the sad history of the room. Legend has it that in 1928, a nurse was found in the room, hung by the neck from a light fixture. The woman had become pregnant out of wedlock by one of the doctors. Depression overtook her. Rather than admit the shame of being pregnant and not married, she took her own life and that of her unborn child. But that wasn't the end of the despair. In 1932, another nurse jumped out of the window, plunging to her death. Unlike the previous woman, no one knows why. People at the time speculated that she may have been pushed out. No one was ever able to solve the mystery. It would seem that one or both of the nurses who had lost their lives in 502 still linger today. Some have witnessed an complete apparition of a woman in white lingering in the doorway of room 502. Others have seen the strange shadows and heard whispers. One thing's for sure, room 502 is not a welcoming place. Often the door closes on its own accord. Many have heard a clear and firm voice saying, "Get out." Visitors can't help but wonder if that's what the nurses heard before she was pushed out of the window. Nowadays, it is possible to wander through Waverly Hills on your own. With the Waverly's long history of disease, suffering patients, neglect, and ultimately deaths, the residents never stop trying to make their story heard by those who listen closely enough. Recently, the hospital was purchased by a private coup who planned to convert it into a 4-star hotel for ghost lovers and thrill seekers. Now the big question is, will the nurses allow anyone staying in room 502 to last the night?